welcome to the program. Now, the coming election of the national leadership of the National Assembly seems to be the dominant political topic in the country at the moment, and that's quite understandable. As we have seen in the last 4 years, what happens in the National Assembly to a large extent determines the shape of government as a whole. For instance, if the National Assembly works at cross purposes with the executive or even work under a cloud of mutual suspicion, the country as a whole suffers. A clear example is the budgetary process of the country. Budget 2018 was not passed into law until 6 months into the very year the budget was meant for. We're now in April 2019 and we still don't have the 2019 budget. So a harmonious working relationship between the executive and legislature without necessarily having to compromise their independence is very important. Now, the front runners for the positions of the President of the Senate and Speaker of the House of Representatives have been busy campaigning and lobbying members of the incoming parliaments for votes. With its dominance of both the Senate and the House of Representatives, the ruling All Progressives Congress is expected to produce the leadership of both chambers. And of course, the party leadership has made it very clear who it is supporting for the office of the President of the Senate. What is actually not very clear at the moment is who the party leadership is supporting for the position of the Speaker of the House. But current Majority Leader Femi Gbajabiamila is the front runner. But other than the politics of the coming election, it's also important to set the agenda for the incoming leaders of the upper and lower chambers of Parliament. And joining me right now to discuss that is Oke Epia, who is the publisher of Other Paper Nigeria and who has also worked in the House of Representatives as spokesperson to a former Deputy Speaker of the House. Okay, thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Thank you, Deji.
Well, I mean, what has been the dominant theme over the past week has been, the politics of the election of the next leadership of the National Assembly. But, let's put that aside now and talk about real issues. Other than this election of the national leadership of the National Assembly now, certain things need to change in the National Assembly, especially in the incoming 9th Assembly. You have worked in that assembly. You've been spokesperson to a former Deputy Speaker. And of course, you've carried out a lot of projects on the National Assembly itself. From your own experience, can you begin to highlight some of those things now that you think need to change?
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Deji. Clearly, the politics of leadership succession in the National Assembly has been the dominant issue, like you have noted. And it's inevitable because, politicians will do their thing. They want power and they will struggle for it. And that's what's going on. My advice...
But unfortunately, you look at the candidates, the aspirants, so to speak, they've not been talking about reform. Let's be candid. You look at the front runners; they've not been talking about the reforms that needs to happen in the assembly. They've just been talking about the politics of things.
Yeah, and that's a point we need to highlight very strongly because it's not enough to get power. You get power for the sake of what? Let me make this baseline submission. You become Senate President, you become Speaker of the House of Reps, you become Deputy Senate President and Deputy Speaker. You are elevated beyond representation of just your constituency. On the national hierarchy of leadership, that's about the third to sixth position. Senate President, Speaker, third, fourth, fifth in that hierarchy. So clearly these are very, important strategic national positions of leadership that ought to make impact, on the lives of Nigerians. And so the questions you have raised about reforms, how would, the quest for power in these positions, how does it affect, the reform that we seek, that Nigerians desire? How does it affect governance? How does it advance democracy? How does it make the impression or the perception of the National Assembly change. There are issues around constituency projects. There are issues around, transparency and accountability of finances and public resources in the National Assembly itself. Like you have said, the aspirants have been short on these issues, and I think that we cannot shy away from them. It's not enough to tell us that they want to be this, they want to be that, but clearly, how do they want to address these reforms, these issues around reforms, and these issues around, getting the National Assembly to really become a pro-people institution that it should be? That's clearly one agenda we must keep.
And of course, one area that one cannot overemphasize, so to speak, and that we just can't talk more about this is that area of the controversial constituency projects. Certain things need to change in the way constituency projects are executed, in the way they are allocated. It's basically what has given rise to all these whole issue of budget padding and what have you.
Clearly, that needs to be addressed. I would say that any aspirants, any contender for the office of this presiding and principal officers of the National Assembly, who is not articulating, a roadmap for constituency projects, is not doing, a lot of service to Nigerians. And I'm sure he's doing some disservice to his aspiration, because like I've noted in my opening remark, these are issues around national leadership. It's not about your separate individual constituencies anymore. It's regrettable, I must say, that for close to about 20 years or so that we have operated some kind of constituency project scheme, there is no law, there is no policy arrangements around it. So it's just some arbitrary scheme that encourages and fosters corruption and impunity, and waste of public resources. And this has to change. In the last assembly, or in the current assembly that is running to a close, there have been two bills, one in the Senate, one in the House of Reps, around, having a law for constituency projects. But you see that they have not been able to pull this through, even at pass it at the level of the House or Senate. It shows that there is no strong commitment to reform that very, very bogus scheme. And I think that going forward, all of these aspirants and contenders for offices in the national leadership at the National Assembly need to clearly articulate. Nigerians are interested. Nigerians want to know how these billions of naira are expended. Nigerians want to know how these projects get to impact them. They want to be able to have inclusiveness. They want to be able to see transparency and accountability in the operation of constituency projects. That's the point. And I think that for those who are aspiring to be the president of the Senate and Speaker of the House of Representatives, we must push the agenda that this is something they really clearly need to articulate and put on the front burner. Otherwise, it's not just about the 469 of them alone who would elect these leaders or these presiding officers. Nigerians are interested. Nigerians want to see what the agenda, what would be in bringing some reforms into this controversial scheme.
Now directly related to that, and I don't know if this is something that would be possible in terms of, maybe enacting a law or look for a way to enforce it. Lawmakers, as we know, are supposed to hold constituency meeting with their constituents from time to time. The fact is that for the majority of these lawmakers, they do not hold this constituency meeting. They do not meet with their constituents at all. And it also ties down to this constituency project. We've actually done some work now on investigating some constituency project, and we know that, look, lawmakers do not consult their constituents before allocating, to find out what exactly they want before allocating constituency projects to, their constituencies. We've seen situations where constituency projects are just allocated haphazardly. In some cases, the local people, the constituents, do not even know such, constituency projects have been allocated to them. And part of the reason for this is the fact that these lawmakers do not hold constituency meetings with their constituents to find out what exactly they want, what their problem is. Is there a way now that the leadership of the National Assembly could begin to enforce that, to ensure that maybe lawmakers at the end of a particular period would have to bring a report card to the floor of the National Assembly to show what exactly they have done in terms of engaging their constituents now?
Deji, I agree with you. You know, constituency consultations is only one leg of the reforms, gamut of reforms that are needed, you know, to get the constituency project scheme right. You know, it's a shame that we still have practices of non-consultations with regards to huge amounts of monies that are expended in the name of constituents. It's a shame, and that needs to stop, like really soon as possible. You know, but you see, this is going to be beyond the resolve of members of the National Assembly. I think Nigerians have to keep making this point and, you know, upscale the demand for these reforms. You know, because I tell you, there is a committee on constituency outreach in the House of Reps, for instance. You know, so clearly there is some level of motion within the National Assembly itself to have some form of organization, you know, towards, you know, the constituency project scheme. But these are just motions, like I said. There are no movements towards, you know, taking the scale of development and democratic inclusion and participation with respect to the ordinary Nigerian on the street, in the rural communities and in their neighborhoods. So these are the demands that we must place, and we can actually use this opportunity of this leadership tussle to upscale that demand. Mr. Ahmed Lawan, you want to be president of the Senate. What are your plans in concrete terms with respect to constituency projects? You know, those who want to be Speaker of the House of Representatives, a couple of them have shown up. You know, beyond just talking to their colleagues, Nigerians want to know what is it that they want to do to reform constituency project scheme. And like I have noted, constituency consultations is just one leg of, you know, the reforms that should happen with that scheme. There are issues around the budgetary disbursements. There are issues around contracting. There are issues around warehousing the projects. You know, there are a couple of issues that all bear around the cardinal critical areas of, you know, transparency, accountability, and inclusiveness of this scheme. We want to see a holistic, you know, agenda from these individuals who want to lead the National Assembly beyond just the politicking. The politicking is right, it is acceptable, it is expected, it is inevitable, but beyond and in the midst of this politicking, Nigerians need to know what is it that they want to bring to the table that will benefit them at the end of the day, not just their own selfish interests for the sake of power and for the sake of influence and ego.
Now, okay, let's talk about the election itself. You know, quite a lot of drama we're seeing. How do you see the election playing out?
The elections are about, they are no less than 2 months away. The National Assembly 9th session resumes in June. You know, it will be proclaimed in June. You know, but as you already see, the horse racing has reached, is almost getting to crescendo. The contention is really, really, really high now, and the agitations are coming from several points. The issues of zoning have also dominated, like you may have noticed. The party's position is being challenged with respect to the zoning of the office of the President of the Senate to this northeast. We have seen that has not reduced the clamor for others who are from other zones from aspiring for that office. In the House of Representatives, the position is not yet clear from the ruling party, but you've seen several contenders showing up and agitating for their zones to produce the office of Speaker and Deputy Speaker and thereabout. But my point would be that, you know, why politicians and the APC would insist that it needs to zone these offices, and that's fine. But I would advise that this zoning should not be to the level of micromanagement, you know, because that's where the problem would arise. When you say certain zones are needing to be brought into the nexus of power sharing, that must be done with respect to, you know, with regards to antecedents and where we are coming from. National balance, you know, national cohesion, these are the factors that count. So I would advise that the APC, the ruling party, and politicians are also able to balance this issue of, you know, sharing these offices along the lines of national balance and cohesion and along the lines of their own party desire to maintain dominance in the National Assembly. Why do I say so? For instance, since 1999, when we've had this current democratic experience, the South-South has neither produced the office of President of the Senate nor Speaker of the House of Representatives. And that is the zone that lays the golden egg for this country. You know, people from that zone also need to have a sense of the feel of what the office of President of the Senate is and what the office of President of Speaker of the House of Representatives also is. Another point that is also being lost in this argument for zoning is the fact that the Southeast, for instance, has enjoyed a lot of prominence with respect to the office of the presiding officers of the National Assembly. The Senate presidency and the deputy Senate presidencies since 1990 date has been alternated in the Southeast. So in the first 8 years of this experiment from 1999 under Obasanjo, the Southeast produced the president of the Senate. In the succeeding 8 years, the Southeast produced the deputy president of the Senate. And like we have seen in the current expiring assembly, the Southeast produced the office of the deputy president of the Senate. So all of these are the kind of antecedents that I want us to take into account. The ruling party is making a point about...
And the irony is that even the Southeast is making a strong case for itself as well, saying that, look, there needs to be balance, there needs to be justice and equity, and that it just would make sense that one of the positions of either the Senate President or at least the Speaker of the House of Representatives be zoned to the southeast of the country so that you have the southeast as well represented in government.
Ironic indeed. It's ironic, because like I've said, and it's by fact, that zone of the country has consistently maintained the top hierarchy of leadership in the Senate, either as president of the Senate or deputy president of the Senate. So, with the complaint about being marginalized and being left out of power sharing with respect to the offices of National Assembly, the presiding offices in specifically, what would the South-South region say? That is neither president of the Senate nor Speaker of the House of Representatives. But I go to, the next source of the ruling party, its argument about zoning these offices. I have seen a very strong agitation from the North Central region about being carried along. Because since the APC revealed its desire or its position to zone the office of the President of the Senate to the Northeast, the North Central has become the loudest with respect to what do we now have. Because that is the region that we have held on to, that is the position rather we have held on to in the last 8 years and thereabouts, 12 years. So now that you are taking it to the Northeast, they are making the point that they should produce office of the Speaker. That I think is a valid argument that the
and you can make the counter argument too that the South too, the North Central too, has actually held that position for a long time. David Mark, for instance, is from the North Central. He was there for 8 years. So Saraki, who is just leaving, who would be leaving the Senate presidency, is also from the North Central as well.
So that's the point I'm making. The party needs to take all of this into account and create a balancing act that takes into clear account the need to balance these offices across a national spread and also to take care of the interest of politicians. The North Central case is premised, and that's a political argument. I am not involved with that. It's premised on the fact that they produce the third highest votes for the president, and so they should be compensated with a key office. And it does make sense, rationally, politically speaking.
Well, the fact is that every zone has got a very genuine complaint. It's a very delicate thing. We just wait and see how this. It's quite delicate, no doubt at all.
It is. And for me, what is more important and what is more delicate to us as Nigerians, as to voters, electors, citizens on the streets, is to see how all of these agitations, how does it all benefit the common Nigerian on the street? How does it lead to ensuring that the wheel of governance runs smoothly with respect to executive-legislative relations, with respect to a reform of the budgetary process, with respect to the reform of the constituencies project scheme, with respect to ensuring that the National Assembly and the executive arm of government work hand in hand to deliver democracy dividends to Nigerians.
All right, okay, finally, there's something else I want us to, I shouldn't say finally now, but there's something else very quickly I wanted you to speak on. And it bothers me a lot when I hear about, members of parliament or even Senate, I'm talking about senators now, members of the House of Representatives, describe certain committees as juicy committee and others as a less juicy committee. And, we see even citizens out there, describe some committee as juicy and others as not juicy. And we're beginning to see agitation along that line now. You have some zones saying that, look, we want the juicy committees of Parliament. The others are saying, look, we don't want the less juicy committee. I mean, you have worked in that Parliament. Is any committee less important than the other?
My answer would be no, especially if the interest is to serve Nigeria. If the interest is to serve your constituency and to serve the generality of Nigeria. You know, whatever committee you find yourself or you are made to serve, you can actually impact your constituency, you can actually impact the entire country with it. You know, so this whole, coinage, juicy or non-juicy committee, unfortunately,
it's actually it's a corrupt coinage, if you ask me. It's basically a very corrupt one. And it connotes corruption completely.
I would agree with you, because it also facilitates the corruption that we see. You know, because when people now eventually land these committees, they are now looking at more of the juice, in quotes, than the work that needs to be done to move the country forward. So when you have someone in charge of the Committee of Petroleum Upstream or Downstream, for instance, they should be less, you find that they are not much bothered about, you know, reforming the sector. The passage of the Petroleum Industry and Governance Bill, all of the other PIBs, there's less attention. You see a lot more focus about what comes from my chairmanship of this committee, and that is sad and that's regrettable. And because we do not have that value reorientation that needs to happen now, that, I'm afraid, will continue to be the driving force for all of these agitations, like I said, for power, and now you have reduced it to juicy committees. It's unfortunate, and I think we need to change that.
Finally, something I have to talk, we just have to talk about the issue of budget padding and this whole budget thing. I mean, the delays we see as we speak now. The 2019 budget has actually not become law. It's still in the National Assembly. Don't you think it's a time that probably the next Assembly might have to come up with a law, you know, a law stipulating when, for instance, the president must submit the budget to the National Assembly and when given the National Assembly to a time frame within which the budget must be considered and passed, so that, you know, things work seamlessly. Because this whole idea of having the budget of a particular year passed in the middle of that year just doesn't make sense at all.
I agree with you, and this is another area that must be highlighted for those who want to become Speaker and Senate President and the rest of them. The budgetary process needs to be reformed. The budgetary process needs to be made to work for the benefit of Nigerians. You know, the timelines and adherence to fiscal circles, these are just parameters. You know, what are the key issues, the key impediments that bedevil the budgetary process? You know, I've made this point severally, and this is one area that we have placed a lot of focus and emphasis in our work at Other Paper. In 2016, we had a colloquium where we had all of the key critical stakeholders in the budgetary process sit down, and we highlighted the 12-point communique on moving the budgetary process forward. If several attempts to take that conversation forward failed, it shows that there is a lack of political will to reform the budgetary process. In the expiring assembly, as we have, there is a budget bill that seeks to reform the budgetary process. What has happened to that bill? No, even take that aside. There is a constitutional amendment proposition about reforming the budgetary process with respect to the timelines for submission of the budget proposal, the timelines for passing the budget and all of that. I mean, that was one fine, beautiful proposal that has got lost in the midst of, you know, politicking, and it didn't sail through in the constitutional amendment process. You know, it would have been a big plus for the country, for the National Assembly, for this government, and for democracy if that amendment had sailed through. It would have been incremental towards addressing the issues around the budgetary process. It may not have been a one-solve-all, but that would have moved the budgetary process forward in terms of reforms. So again, I state the point that these individuals who want to be president of the Senate, who want to be Speaker of the House of Representatives and their deputies, these are the issues that in concrete terms they need to articulate to both, not just their colleagues, but to entire Nigerian citizenry, so that people can access them. People can take a closer look at their capacity, their competence, and their ability to deliver leadership beyond just for the sake of power for their own purposes.
Okay, Pierre, publisher, Other Paper Nigeria, thank you very much for joining us on the program and for your wonderful thoughts there.
It's my pleasure, Deji. Thank you.